Welcome, Dr. Staff, who will talk about research.
All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I don't have a ton of slides today, but I thought it'd be good to kind of help orient everyone and maybe get everyone on the same level. Everybody's usually at different stages of their understanding of kind of what research is when it comes to ALS, and so I'll try to give a little background on that, and then kind of talk about thoughts one might have when considering volunteering to be in research studies for ALS, and then finally we'll kind of go through the reports of clinical trials that have completed recently, and then also talk about kind of what trials are available in the Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota area. So I think it's always useful for everyone to see financial disclosures. So this just kind of tells you some of my interactions with funding agencies over the years. So I've served as site principal investigator for a number of industry-sponsored trials. That's up above. I get some funding. My work as an editor for a journal, and then I get research grant support from the institutes down below, both NIH, got one through the state of Minnesota, and then two ALS specific foundations, Target ALS, and then the ALS Association. So clinical research, it's kind of a big part, there's a big aspect to that. It's not just clinical trials. And so when thinking specifically about clinical research that's not clinical trials, as you may have experienced, we have a number of trials, or rather a number of research programs that are going on to understand the disease better. And, as a way for people to volunteer to be involved in research that may not be quite as involved or extensive or time committed as clinical trials. So there are things that include questionnaires. Some groups are doing studies of imaging of the brain and the spinal cord. There are electrophysiology studies that are ongoing in different places. And then probably the most common thing that you'll see in the clinic are research projects that are involving biosamples. So oftentimes it's either give a sample of blood, sometimes even saliva, and then for those who are interested, you could even provide some spinal fluid or a skin biopsy. And so those are available. They're oftentimes one-stop shop kind of when you come through the clinic, and you can do things to help you volunteer for research in ALS. And then what most people are interested in talking about, though, are clinical trials. So those are part of clinical research, and those are clinical research projects that involve trying to figure out whether a treatment is safe and beneficial for people who have ALS. The drug development pipeline is long, it's arduous. There's a lot of parts to it. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the research money and the research that's being done in ALS is being done at what's called the basic research level. So these are things that aren't in patients. So often being tested in cell models of ALS. Sometimes there are projects ongoing where you can take human skin fibroblasts, turn them into stem cells, which then can become motor neurons. And then you can have kind of an ALS disease in a dish model and study aspects of the disease. And that's been very beneficial over the last several years, where those sorts of disease in a dish models have come to fruition. And then also animal models. So there are a number of models of ALS in animal systems that can range from fruit flies to zebrafish to what's most commonly done are in the rodent models, so mouse or rats. Obviously, rats are not humans, so one always has to be a little careful about making broad interpretations. And in fact, we've done pretty well at coming up with a lot of different treatments that have slowed down the disease in animal models that haven't translated into drugs that have been useful in humans. But just recognize that a lot of research in ALS and a lot of research that gets press in ALS. So if you're hearing stories in the news about the latest hot ALS research, oftentimes it's referring to this type of research, basic science research, where maybe a new molecule's been discovered that's important in the pathway of ALS, maybe a new gene's been discovered. But oftentimes what that means is because it's very early in the drug development pipeline, it's going to be a long time before those particular discoveries make their way into a meaningful treatment and even a testable treatment in humans with the disease. So kind of looking at this schema here, which came from an FDA documentation, there's obviously basic research where there are discoveries, and then there's a huge process of trying to find how a drug can be optimized in a way both that is most specific for ALS, but then also, to look at early safety indicators in both cell systems, animal models, to make sure that any drug that's developed before it gets into a person has really gone through the rigors of showing that it's behaving like it should in these more simple systems. And then clinical development. So over here, further on the right, we have clinical trials. So historically, these are broken down into what are called phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 clinical trials. And that kind of, you can see they're kind of going in a specific order. So sorry, I got ahead of myself. So a couple terms I wanted to bring up before I got into the clinical trials, just so everybody knows what we're talking about. So placebos. Placebo is when a person is given a treatment, and it may be an inactive treatment. So there's a drug that's being tested, and the drug's being compared with a placebo, which could be something as simple as salt water or sugar water. And it's typically in a way that neither the investigator nor the person with ALS will know whether they're getting a placebo, which isn't the drug, or the drug itself. So oftentimes people are very interested to know whether the trial that they're interested in has a placebo part to it. So worried that they may not be able to get the actual active drug. Open label extension is another important term in clinical trials. Many trials are incorporating open label extensions into their clinical trials. And what these are is basically at the end of the study, you would have an opportunity to continue to take the drug. So if you enroll in a study and you spend maybe 6 to 12 months in the study, maybe there is a placebo, maybe there's not, but you know that at the end of that 6 to 12 month period, you have the option of for sure getting the drug. And oftentimes then you can kind of take that drug until the company has kind of gotten to the end of their drug development, and maybe they've submitted to the FDA, or maybe ultimately decided that it found out that it didn't work. But a lot of drug trials are trying to incorporate these open label extensions into their trials, which I think is good for everyone. Safety, just recognizing that this is research, and it's important that we look at safety in these clinical trials. Obviously, people who have ALS have a very bad disease, a fatal disease, and so the willingness to assume risk for these drug trials is higher than would be, say if somebody's taking it for mild hypertension. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not making the disease dramatically worse, or causing severe side effects that limit quality of life and possibly quantity of life. So safety is always needing to be taken into account. The term efficacy, that basically just means, is the drug working? Is it slowing the disease down? Is it providing benefit to people who have ALS? And then an important aspect is the term inclusion or exclusion criteria. So every trial has their own versions of this. So they have, it's basically the rules of the road, the rules for a clinical trial where patients need to kind of be able to satisfy certain criteria. Oftentimes, there's an age limit that's on it. Most commonly, there's a breathing function limit that's on that. Sometimes it's how bad the disease is. Duration of disease is very common as well. But each of those, each trial has their own version of it. And there are some that are similar across trials, but some that are very specific. And some are more restrictive and some are less restrictive. So those are the things that need to keep in mind as you're looking into those trials. So getting back to where I was before, clinical trials, so again, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So a phase 1 clinical trial tends to be small numbers of patients. So roughly 10 to 50 people would be in a phase 1 trial. It's often done at a single center. So only one university is doing this. It could still be being run by a company, but also could be run by the university itself. It's primarily focused on safety. That it's one of these. It's the first time it's getting into patients with ALS, so there's a lot of unknowns the first time it hits the human biology. So there's a lot of things looking at safety. Usually there aren't placebos in phase 1 clinical trials. Again, because we're trying to really make sure is that there's safety there. They're trying to get the most patients receiving the drug in that phase 1 study. And oftentimes there isn't an open label extension in a phase 1 study, mostly because it's a very small trial, and then they often don't even know which dose is the right dose that they want to use at a phase 1 level. Phase 2 gets to be a bigger trial, kind of in the 50 to 200 participant range. Oftentimes it's branching out to incorporate more sites. So maybe across the country, there are several groups that are enrolling. Oftentimes they're trying to find more about the dosing. So there might be a number of different doses that are in the trial. And they're starting to get an early signal on whether there's a benefit or this efficacy that I mentioned earlier. They may or may not have a placebo. It's not always the case, but certainly a lot of them do. And then more of the phase 2 trials often will have this open label extension aspect to it. And then finally, phase 3 clinical trial. So that's the big trial. It's often 200 to 500 participants in it. It's often many sites, often many countries, really designed specifically to try to answer the question as to whether there's any benefit of the drug or treatment for ALS. They almost always have a placebo arm to it. And most of them now also have an open label extension aspect to it. I should say for the open label extension, oftentimes what plays into that for some of the companies is that some of the drugs are very, very expensive to produce. If it's a pill that can be churned out that making 10,000 pills is similar to making 1,000 pills, that company is more likely to offer open label extension versus whether it's a biologic drug or a cell therapy, for example. Those often can cost tens of thousands of dollars per person. So they're often less likely to have an open label extension associated with them. Right. And then a couple things probably worth bringing up are the ideas of expanded access programs and right to try. So these are 2 ways that folks can get access to medications that are outside of a clinical trial. They tend to be very limited. The companies themselves basically have to agree upfront that they're willing to support providing drug for expanded access or right to try. They're similar in some ways, those 2 programs. The expanded access program actually does go through the FDA. There's an application for it, and basically everybody who applies for the expanded access gets approved for that. The big thing there is that the company needs to approve it, that they're going to do it. And then also the investigator needs to put a little bit of time into putting together the protocol and the paperwork to make it happen. And then there's some reporting that the investigator needs to do back to the FDA in terms of any side effects that people get in the course of the expanded access. Pretty small amount of work that goes into those. The rate limiting factor there typically is companies, that most companies don't offer expanded access to their drugs until typically after they're done with the phase 3 trial. So maybe the trial's done, but they haven't fully gone to the FDA for approval. So currently there is an expanded access program for a drug called Telferson, which I'll talk about later, which is specifically for SOD1, patients who have SOD1 related ALS. There are expanded access programs for the Neuron brainstorm trial also, but for that one, you have to have been in their phase 3 clinical trial. So in some ways, it's almost more of an open label extension of a limited source. The difference between expanded access and right to try really is whether the FDA is involved or not. Through the expanded access, it needs to go through the FDA. Again, a little bit of paperwork, they all get approved. For right to try, you don't have to go through the FDA at all. But still, the big thing is that the company needs to agree to provide the drug. And most companies aren't willing to do that for a number of reasons. Part of it is cost, part of it is they want to kind of get all the information they can for people who are taking the drug. And so while this right to try legislation it was exciting when it came through, in reality, there's been very, very little use of that mechanism to get drugs for patients. All right, so what does one consider success in a clinical trial? Let's see. So, I think ideally, we find a drug or a treatment that impacts ALS. In the perfect world, we find one that cures and reverses ALS. Fortunately, we have not seen that yet. Next level, I think it would be great if we could stop the progression of ALS. Fortunately, we have not seen that yet either. So at this point, the main things that we're seeing and most of the drugs in development are expecting to do is to slow the progression. So maybe take somebody whose normal duration of disease would be 3 years and hopefully kick it out multiple years longer than that. So the two drugs that are kind of in that category that are FDA approved are riluzole and edaravone or radicava. Probably all familiar with those two drugs. The first one's a pill, the second one's an infusion. They both slow the disease down by a little bit. Probably some variability in terms of how much it affects a given person, but on average, riluzole is quoted to prolong life for roughly 3 months. Edaravone's quoted to slow the disease down by about 33%. Again, we don't know whether that's the same in every person. I suspect that some people have more or less of a response to those drugs. Another type of successful trial would be one that treated symptoms but doesn't change the course of the disease. So Nuedexta for pseudobulbar palsy or pseudobulbar affect would be the drug that would kind of fit into that category, amongst a number of other things that are used off-label for symptoms. Another thing that would consider being a success in clinical trial is kind of how it's run. So it's successful if it's able to answer the research question quickly and correctly. So we all want drugs to get to the FDA and get out in general population as quickly as possible. And so it's successful if it answers that question quickly and correctly either way, right? So we don't want to have a drug out there that ultimately doesn't work, and it took 5 years of clinical trials to sort that out. It would be much better if we could get an answer no much quicker and move on to the next drug in the pipeline. Likewise, if it's a beneficial drug, we want to get that question answered very quickly and get it out to patients more broadly as quickly as possible. And those two parts to the clinical trial, answering it quickly and correctly, is often the reason why the trial designs aren't maybe as friendly to people with ALS as we would like them to be. And a big part of this is that ALS really acts differently in different people. So, and we all know this, whether that's where the disease starts, in the face region or in the hand or an arm, or rates of progression. So some people have very fast progression of disease, some people have very slow progression of the disease. And this variability actually makes it hard to prove whether a drug works or not in a clinical trial. And that just kind of comes down to statistics of the statistical methods that are used to show whether there's a benefit or not. And so what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are really trying to do is decrease this variability. So make it so there's more of a homogeneous group of people who are going through clinical trials. And then that would increase the likelihood of answering that research question quickly and correctly. Hopefully, that would then be generalizable to everybody who has ALS. But if we can get it through the system quickly and get an answer quickly, then that can go out and be again sent out to the general population. So oftentimes when I'm talking with somebody about whether they want to be involved in a clinical trial, I kind of go through a number of things to kind of a thought process. So, I think most importantly up front is to recognize that it's research. It's not clinical care. We don't know whether a drug or treatment is going to be beneficial for people. There's, the safety expectations that one has with FDA approved medications isn't there yet because we're still trying to understand whether it's safe or not. But the flip side is that we will not get any drugs approved if people with ALS don't volunteer for these studies. So that's balanced with that you get access to experimental therapies. So, on one hand, as an individual, we want to be able to get access to experimental therapies, take a chance with finding something that's going to be beneficial to you individually, but recognizing that benefit, if it's not directly to you, will eventually benefit other people with ALS. It's a big time commitment. A lot of these clinical trials, they may run 6 months, they may run 12 months, some of them are even up to 2 years. And, we're trying to design them better to make them less intrusive. Obviously there's more and more technology that should be able to allow us to have patients not have to come to the clinic every 2 to 6 weeks, which is oftentimes the frequency in which one needs to come to the clinic for these trial visits. And there's lots of poking and prodding. It's not a just kind of show up and say hello and take a pill. A lot of these medications and trials involve blood draws, some involve lumbar punctures. So it's something kind of upfront that's needs to be recognized. For some people, as I mentioned before, it's really important to know whether there's a placebo or not. Some people that's kind of a deal breaker. Other people are willing to kind of take the chance with the placebo and kind of think of recognize that even if they get a placebo, it's helping the overall mission of research and the overall goal of getting more treatments for more patients. And then obviously, wondering whether there would be an open label extension at the end of a clinical trial that would allow a person to get the medication at the end of the day, at the end of the trial. I think this is important, and we've had a lot of history in clinical trial research in ALS and recognize that most of the therapies we try in clinical trials don't work. They don't help people with ALS. But I can guarantee that even if a given trial doesn't work, that volunteering for that still helps future generations of people with ALS. And by that, I mean that, we're able to get through the trial as quickly as possible to move on to the next medication that may be providing benefits for people with ALS. And I often kind of somewhat joke to people is that, kind of try to envision oneself at the end of a clinical trial and being at the end of that clinical trial and having had no benefit from the drug or placebo that one was taking during the clinical trial, and trying to imagine how one would feel at that point. Is it something that really is upsetting, that you feel like you wasted your time, that you were angry about it? If that's the case, it's probably not something that one should do. It's probably not something that's a good fit for you. If, on the other hand, one kind of gets to the end and says, well, okay, well, I know I helped future generations, it didn't help me, but I'm happy that I spent the time doing it and consider that it was worthwhile to do, then that's probably a good fit for you. And frankly, there's no judgment there. I mean, I consider my job in the ALS clinic to try to help people do what they want to do. For some people that's clinical research, for other people it's not. And we work with other people to do what they want to do. Some people want to work until they can't work anymore. Some people want to quit the day they get the diagnosis. And it's the same sort of thing that, everybody has different things that bring them joy, that bring them fire, that get them out of bed in the morning. And this is just one of those things. So kind of along those lines, just recognize, so this is a website. It's through the NEALS Consortium or the Northeast ALS Consortium. And it's probably the best tool out there to find clinical trials for ALS. And I'll kind of go through the ones that are open in the region, but this also will kind of allow you to see what's available nationally. So moving into the trials themselves, let's see how I'm doing for time. So recognizing that clinical trials are being designed for specific types of ALS. So there are, as most of you know, there's kind of two big categories of ALS. There's familial ALS, or hereditary, meaning that the genes typically inherited from mom or dad. People who have this form of the disease, which is roughly 10 to 15% of all people who have ALS, almost invariably will have a strong family history of ALS in their family, or possibly a strong family history of frontotemporal dementia. The one thing that doesn't always follow that rule is the C9orf72 gene mutation, which we do see periodically in people who don't have clear family histories. The rest of the genes typically have strong family histories. And the three most common genes I have listed up here are SOD1, which was the original gene found in ALS, and for which there's a strong drug development program to treat that specific mutation. C9orf72 is the most common mutation that causes ALS, and there are a number of drugs being developed to specifically treat that type of ALS. And then FUS is probably the next most common, and there is actually a gene therapy program for that as well that's open and running. There aren't any, nobody in Minnesota is doing that, but there are other centers around the country that are available if people have the FUS mutation. Sporadic ALS is the remainder, so the majority of people who have ALS, so roughly 85 to 90% of people who have ALS, and in that setting, we don't know what's really causing it. We expect that it is some combination of your general genetic makeup, so not a specific gene, but maybe kind of multiple genes that you have that gave you a slightly increased risk of developing ALS, and that was somehow combined with some sort of environmental exposure, of which there are many environmental causes that are thought to be playing a slight role in ALS, and kind of this perfect storm of the genetics and environment coming together to trigger the development of sporadic ALS. And so the bullets that I have below here just kind of are pointing out the different mechanisms that are generally trying to be targeted in sporadic ALS. So the free radicals and mitochondrial health, that's kind of where edaravone lives and is thought to be beneficial. And there's a number of other drugs in the pipeline that are kind of going after that mechanism further. Glutamate excitotoxicity was what riluzole is thought to work at. There's a number of drugs coming through the pipeline for neuroinflammation. So there's an increasing recognition that the immune system probably plays a role in kind of the rate of progression of ALS. Then there's neurotrophic factors that are being delivered in a number of ways. Muscle enhancers are another target of treatment in ALS. And then there are a number of kind of specific novel pathways that have been shown, again, typically in animal models or in cell models to be important in the development of ALS or the progression of ALS that are being targeted by specific small molecules. And I'll say that, I think I've been doing this over 10 years now, and the number of clinical trials that are currently open and going to be open over the next several years is much more than it's ever been. And I think that's really exciting, in terms of, again, trying to get these drugs through quickly and get answers quickly and hopefully bring things to patients quickly. And it also means it can be a little bit confusing in terms of the landscape, and patients with ALS actually may have kind of more choices in terms of what they may want to get involved in. And so it's an interesting time, and I think a good time in terms of our increasing our likelihood of finding really good treatments for this disease. So I'm just going to talk about 3 different drugs that have been that have had published results over the last couple of years in ALS, and then I'll just kind of list off let you go through the ones that are currently open. So this is the drug Telferson, which is I don't even have that word. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so Telferson for people who have the specific SOD1 mutant form of ALS. Again, a pretty rare form of ALS, but this drug, which is a novel sort of drug that is injected into the spinal fluid, blocks the development of this SOD1 protein, and has been shown, has been developed for people with that form of ALS. So the publication last year was for their early phase trial, their phase 1, phase 2 trial. And, kind of got some fancy graphs here, but basically showing that in a group of people who had a fast form of the disease, so fast progressors, there was a slowing of the disease, small numbers, and then also that a marker in the spinal fluid that is linked to neuronal breakdown, a molecule called neurofilament, actually decreased in patients with high amounts of Telferson. So that was the publication in 2020. Unfortunately, just a few months ago, we found out that their phase 3 study, which was fully completed and enrolled, did not actually meet its primary endpoint. So using this, the scale, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the ALS functional rating scale, there wasn't a statistically significant difference between those who received Telferson and those who did not. Having said that, everything was going in the right direction for benefit. And there was very, very strong data to suggest that the neurofilament levels were dropping quite dramatically in those who were receiving Telferson. So the idea is that there was probably significant neuroprotection, so fewer neurons dying off in those receiving Telferson versus those who didn't. But it didn't cause enough benefit clinically to show a change in the ALS functional rating score. So this kind of gets back to how one designs a trial and making sure that you get an answer at the end of the day that you can hang your hat on and be confident is correct. So I think there's still some significant work to be done here. I believe that the company Biogen is planning on going to the FDA to kind of get some further guidance as to what their next steps should be. And I know that the Biogen is already planning so one thought is that maybe the patients that were enrolled in this trial were already too advanced in their disease, and they're developing a trial that would actually treat people before they became symptomatic. So that's Telferson. Another drug that's gotten a lot of exciting news is AMX0035, which is a combined product of sodium phenylbutyrate and torosodiol. This is by a company called Amylyx. And they published this also in late 2020, showing in a large phase 2 study. So this wasn't a full phase 3 study, but a large phase 2 study where 89 patients received the drug and 48 patients received placebo over a 24-week period, that there was a statistically significant benefit in terms of the ALS functional rating score. So this was a very exciting study results. They followed it up with a study that looked at survival. And this graph here is a survival curve. So if you're at 1.0, that means 100% are alive at the randomization point. And then this shows so out to 18 months, the median survival for those who were on placebo versus those who were receiving the AMX035, they lived out to 25 months. So showing, at least in this somewhat limited study, some survival benefit also, in addition to the improvement in the ALS functional rating score. So the clinical development for this is that they have submitted an application to the FDA and have also submitted applications to the European and Canadian health authorities to try to get this drug approved. Don't know exactly when we'll hear back from the FDA and those other agencies. At the same time, the company is developing a phase 3 trial, a larger phase 3, to try to be ready in case the FDA says they need to do a big phase 3 trial. Historically, the FDA has required at least one and often two phase 3 trials to be positive before they would approve a drug as a therapy for ALS or any disease for that matter. The FDA has become more lenient over the last few decades. So Radicava was approved on the strength of a single trial. And there are mechanisms in place for diseases such as ALS that the FDA could approve for a phase 2 study, which would be like this study with Amylyx. So more to come for this. And then the final study that released results, this was about a year ago, it hasn't been published in a paper, but they've reported it at meetings, is the stem cell product. So this is a mesenchymal stem cell that's been kind of modified to secrete extra neurotrophic factors. It's called Neuron from a company called Brainstorm. And this is the kind of their main graph showing that there were trends toward improvement in patients who received the Neuron versus placebo, but it didn't, again, reach statistical significance. When they looked at a subset of patients that weren't as severely affected, that treatment effect was quite a bit more robust. And so this company is also still in the process of kind of working with the FDA in terms of what next steps might be for them. but more to come on that, I think. So just go through the other trials that are open currently in the area. So probably the biggest one is the Healy ALS platform trial. So this is being enrolled up in the cities as well as here. It's a bit in a slowdown right now. They've been so successful in how they've enrolled over the country that there aren't a lot of slots available, despite having enrolled hundreds of people into this trial. It's a phase 2 study. It's large phase 2. A quarter of the patients get placebo, but there's the option for open label extension. And it's really set up to be able to pull multiple drugs into the trial. So they're continually adding drugs to this trial with the idea that this will constantly be available for patients and drug companies. A trial we're doing here at Mayo is looking at these MSCs, the mesenchymal stromal cells, again, or stem cells that are a little different than the ones from Neuron. And this is a phase 2 study. It's open label, so everybody gets treatment. There's no placebo. We're over halfway, about 2/3 of the way done with enrollment for that. And that's available down here. People get 4 injections in the spinal fluid over the course of a year for that trial. A drug being done up at Hennepin County as a phase 2 study of pegcetacoplan. Boy, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to say that. Pegcetacoplan. This is a drug that's targeting neuroinflammation. Another drug that's thought to target inflammation is Ibutalas. So this is a larger phase 3 study that we're enrolling here at Mayo as well as up in Hennepin. Their phase 2 study was exciting in that there were a large number of responders to that drug. And so we're trying to get a final answer for that drug. So that is placebo controlled in a 1-to-1 fashion. And then finally, there's a oral version of Radicava or edaravone. So this is the same drug that's currently FDA approved in a IV form, now has an oral formulation, and they're taking that through and comparing the dosage as it is done in the IV setting, which is 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, to an everyday dosing of the drug in oral formulation for both of them over the course of a year. This is hopefully they'll be able to get this then approved through the FDA pretty readily. So all the challenges that we're having with infusions of edaravone will go away. This, again, there's no placebo in this arm or they're in this study, but one needs to have not had Radicava and been earlier in the disease to get enrolled in that study. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention, and happy to take questions or engage in any amount of discussion.
And
I have a question.
I just want to say before people get started that this is all being recorded and will be available on our website. So if you don't want to be visible, feel free to, or have your name out there, feel free to chat me or email me your question and I can ask it. Go ahead, Danielle.
So Dad's on a trach, obviously, and we've been told that we're not allowed to do trials because of the trach. Do we know of any trials that would take him because he's on the trach? Or maybe we're misinformed.
Right. No, that's a good question. And every trial has their own specific inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Right.
And as far as I know, all of the trials that I've listed up here do not allow one to have a trach for the trial. You know, and part of that kind of gets back to the design of the trial and being able to try to quickly and reliably answer the question of whether a drug's working or not.
Right. Well, if you find one or you come across one, we'd love to be part of it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And there's a question in the chat. Can you define neurotropic factors?
Sure. Yeah. So thanks for that question. Yeah, it is a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's a number of molecules that are kind of in a certain class that have been shown primarily in animal studies and in basic science studies to have neuroprotective qualities. So they keep cells alive longer. And so there have been studies over the years that have both given neurotrophic factors either through pills or through injections. More recently, we're trying to get them into the nervous system directly, either via spinal puncture, or there's even been trials elsewhere where they put in kind of reservoirs that drain it into the brain itself. So some specific ones that are often talked about as being important in ALS are vascular endothelial growth factor, so VEGF, VEGF, hepatocyte growth factor, HGF, which was named after how well it is to keep liver cells alive, but it actually works well in neurons also. One of the larger studies that was done in this regard was for a growth factor called IGF-1. But there's a number of them that have been studied and continue to be studied as possible drugs or part of other drugs that can be used for ALS.
Other questions?
Looks like somebody's talking, but on mute.
Oh.
Chukri?
Oh, hi, Chukri. Did you have a question? Where did he go?
Yep, still on mute.
Okay.
There we
Now,
go.
okay. I am a patient at Mayo. I got diagnosed with PLS 8 months ago, but my progression is faster than ALS. I reached out to Dr. Windebank, in fact, 2 days ago, for being involved in a research. He denied me. He says I'm not eligible. So when is a person becomes eligible? Because my symptoms had gone down in 8 months faster than any with ALS. And they keep telling me I have PLS. But I go to all the ALS meetings. I've seen Dr. Sorensen, Dr. Crum, Dr. Jones, and I lived across, I moved here from California to be close to the Maine.
Yeah, thank you for that question and comment. It comes back to that in these research clinical trials, there are just very specific criteria that need to be met in order to be able to be enrolled in the study. I think it's very hard. We would obviously like to have everybody who wants to be in a trial be able to volunteer and be enrolled in a trial. But oftentimes the FDA limits things. Other times it's trying to again get an answer quickly and correctly. And in order to do that, it limits the number of patients that are eligible to be in the study. Some other trials, one nice thing that's been the case for the Healy trial is that they've actually had a much more liberal enrollment criteria. Still not, as great as we'd like it to be, But the respiratory status is a little more lenient. The duration of disease is more lenient. But at the end of the day, as our coordinators and the principal investigators for the trials can't get somebody into a trial if they don't meet the criteria. So I'm sorry, it's been frustrating for you.
And so I received a message today from Dr. Winterbank saying that looking at my EMG, I only have upper neuron, not lower. So I don't qualify.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead, Ann.
No, I was just going to say there are a couple other questions. One sort of, I think, fits with this. Are any of the trials available for patients that have shown symptoms for more than the typical 2-year limit? And I think this fits with what you're saying also.
Yeah, I believe that Healy is 3 years, but most of them are 2 years.
Okay.
And how does the research landscape today compare to 5 years ago? And what do you predict for the next 5?
Yeah, no, that's.
And remember, this is being recorded.
So you're going to show it to me in 5 years and
Exactly.
see how well I did. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, we certainly understand many more mechanisms of the disease at a basic science level than we ever did 5-10 years ago. On one hand, that's related to the increasing number of genetic causes of ALS that we now know that we didn't know 10 years ago. And kind of the corollary of that is that with each new gene that we discover new pathways that are involved in ALS that hopefully has an impact on the broader ALS population, those with sporadic disease, not just those who have that specific mutation, perhaps. And as that goes along, there's also been an amazing explosion in terms of tools that are becoming available to develop new drugs in kind of a designer fashion that never existed before. The ability to quickly scan all of the drugs that are out there and see whether they might, from a computer modeling standpoint, might impact a pathway that we think is important in ALS, and be able to bring drugs up quickly that way, or develop new drugs that are genetic drugs, like has been done in Telferson, that now is being moved over to the FUS model, as well as the C9orf. And hopefully that same sort of technology could then be used for pathways that we know are deranged in sporadic ALS as well. So I think the more designer drugs is really the way I would see the future panning out. And I think on top of that, we've become much more sophisticated in how we design the trials to, again, try to get at that. If we do the trial, are we going to get a good answer at the end of the trial? And can we do it quickly and get an answer quickly so we can get it through to the FDA or get rid of it quickly? And so, the drug development pipeline's being sped along in a way that it hadn't, I don't think it existed 10 years ago.
Good questions. Any others?
I have a question about expanded access more. Since I'm 4 years since diagnosis, I don't qualify for any clinical trials. So expanded access would be my only option for investigational treatments. So if the legislation Act for ALS that's in Congress right now gets passed and funded, how would that be facilitated? Would a drug company, say Clean Pharmaceuticals, apply for one of those grants? And then would the money be distributed, or the drug be distributed through the clinical trial sites that they've been using, or how would that work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had the answer to it. I think part of that is as that, so this Act for ALS, which is going through the legislature right now, it may end up in a different form if hopefully it will get passed at the end of the day. And then how it actually goes from a law to being enacted, through the executive branch. I don't know how that's going to ultimately look. And I think oftentimes, once the bill gets done, exactly, who runs the show there it gets kind of decided after the fact. I'm very interested in that as well. I think, again, for most of these things, it's the drug company that needs to make the decision whether they're going to do expanded access or not. And as you said, there actually have been a couple companies that have worked with Harvard, and have done some larger expanded access trials there that haven't been done other places. And if that sort of infrastructure could be kind of built out across the country to allow people who can't travel to Boston to be able to get access, I think that would be fantastic. But exactly how it's going to play out, I really don't know. I wish I knew, but I'm very excited and happy to see that legislature is moving quickly through Congress and has lots of sponsors and was it voted on today or something? I know there was a vote coming soon in the House and then trying to get it to the Senate.
I do want to say we're at 4 o'clock, so if folks need to leave, I get it. There is one last question. Can you talk more about studies targeting immune response?
Yeah, so this is a little bit more of a new area of research in ALS, or at least it's become more prominent more recently. And there have been people who've been studying it for decades, but it's really kind of caught on in terms of being a treatment target. And there's a couple of different pathways that are being looked at in the immune system. And I think most people think that the immune system, the role that it's playing is most likely kind of determining how fast progression is. Kind of from a logical standpoint, that if the immune system's kind of not working well, that it's making the disease go faster than it would otherwise. And that by modulating the immune system, one could slow the disease down. There are actually some people who think that it's primarily being driven by the immune system, that there are aspects, both in terms of latent retroviruses that could be in the system, as well as other aspects of the innate immunity that could be inciting and being part of the player that starts the disease process. And then there's other parts of the immune system that are being targeted that are more on kind of the white blood cell side. So most of the drugs that are out there are targeting what's called the complement system, which is a specific aspect of the immune system. And there are a number of different drugs that have been moving along trying to get answers there. It's thought that the mesenchymal stem cells modulate the immune system in a way that is beneficial for ALS. Stan Appel in Texas is leading trials on the T regulatory cells, which are specific white blood cells that are thought to be involved in kind of how ALS works. And so there's a lot of different targets that are going on, and this kind of speaks to my comment before that there's a lot of activity in ALS, a lot of different drugs, a lot of different targets, and a lot of different trials that are coming through and hopefully coming through quickly, and because it can't be fast enough. And I think you're on mute.
The oral form of Radicava that you were talking about, any prediction about how long that might be till the FDA approval?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the trials just started over the last 6 months, and I haven't seen their enrollment data, because basically it needs to get to the end of the trial, and then, or at the end of enrollment, and then a year from that point. I don't know if it'll be slightly different situation because it's basically an already approved FDA drug, if they have a different pathway that they can use. I don't know the answer to that. Hopefully it would be quicker than some of the other companies are having to deal with.
And there is a question, and this does have to be the last one, folks, about natural things that might have been tested, such as lion's mane. And I will send the websites for ALS Untangled, the NEALS website, and the ALS registry to everyone who's here. But do you have anything to add about natural?
That one I don't know much about. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I don't know whether ALS Untangled's done any work on that yet.
No, it is one of the things that people can vote on, I think,
Okay.
or it was, so.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming and
you.
sharing this wisdom.
Thank
I-
you.
Thank you.
I will go through and try and share things in an email that I send to everybody.
All right.
And I'll include you, or I'll send it to you, Dr. Staff, first, just in case I mess something up.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Hopefully we don't get snowed in. Stay safe, stay warm. And
And there is a thank you for all the great information here in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you all for coming out and
Thank you.
good questions.
Thank you, Dr.
Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Snow days are another reason that this virtual format works.
Exactly.
Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.